At the time, I was the director of Trinity Institute at Trinity Church Wall Street, which was a kind of theological think tank. And my office was only a half a block from Ground Zero. So I was there that day, and it was the scariest day of my life. Rowan Williams, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was my guest at Trinity Church that day. He was going to do a video shoot called The Shape of a Holy Life, which is kind of ironic because terrorists thought they were martyrs and leading the most supreme kind, or it was the most supreme kind of act that they were committing. Rowan arrived at Trinity Church in the lobby of our office building at 8:35 that morning. I took him up to my office on the 21st floor so he could have some quiet time before he went into makeup and for the shoot that was to begin at 9 o'clock. At 8:46, the first plane went in, and the sound of it was just unbelievable. I thought it went right over the top of my head and was going to take off the top of our building. And then the crash was not something that you heard, it was a percussion. So I ran across the hall into my study where Rowan was, and I said, "Some cowboy's just gone through the sound barrier." And he said, "Yeah, what was that?" And so began the beginning of the scariest day of our lives. We got up and looked out the window, and already there was a blizzard of debris flying past the window. And at the opposite end of the hall, some of my staff began to scream because their windows looked right out onto the World Trade Center. And we raced down the hall to see what had happened, stood in horror watching the black smoke pour out of the World Trade Center, and thought like everybody else that it was a freak accident. But it was close to 9 o'clock, and we thought we'd better go down to the television studio on the 11th floor. And when we got there, 21 of the spiritual directors we had brought in from around the country to sit with Rowan on the set and talk to him about the meditations he was going to give were already there. And as we sat on the set watching a television, the second plane went in, and suddenly we knew we were in a war zone. These security people told us to stay put because they did not really know what was going on outside and what might ensue, and so we sat on the set for the next 20 minutes. And then all of a sudden, our building began to shake. There was a huge roar, and as the building collapsed, though we didn't know what was happening, the floor upon floor, it sounded like an explosion, so we all thought that we were being bombed. And in the darkness, because the lights had gone out, all of us hit the floor. When the lights came back on, we were able to identify what had happened. The first tower had collapsed, but the room began to fill with soot and smoke to the point where we could hardly breathe. And so we began to panic. We didn't know what to do. And the security people told us to go out into an exterior flight of stairs where there was no ventilation and less soot and smoke. But the fact of the matter was it had permeated the whole building. And at one point I thought we had maybe 15 minutes to live in that atmosphere. And found myself standing on a stairwell with Rowan Williams and 4 or 5 other colleagues, and wondering how much time we had left when Elizabeth Koenig, who teaches at Virginia at the Episcopal Seminary in New York City, came over to Rowan, put her hands on his shoulders, and said to him, "I can't think of anybody I'd rather die with." And that was an amazing moment, the most critical moment of my life, because in that instance, I recognized 2 things. I was not afraid to die. I was perfectly calm in the face of death and was quite surprised by that phenomenon. And the second thing was, when Elizabeth brought to voice the anxiety that we all had, the apprehension of death and the feeling that we were going to die, we all bonded in a circle of love that in that moment from that moment on, will never be broken. We were comrades in the face of death, and in that moment I discovered the true meaning of being. It is to be with, to be in relationship with, and the love of God nothing can separate us, not a terrorist act, not a hurricane, from the love of God that we found manifested in ourselves together in that circle of love. So that moment was critical and important for me. And the next day, I won't give you the details of how we managed to get out of that situation, but the next day Rowan was to give an endowed lecture at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in the upper part of Manhattan. And we all managed to get there, and so did 100 other people. And when he took the podium, he gave his prepared text to the Bishop of New York and said, I wish to think with you about the events of yesterday. And he gave a spontaneous meditation in that moment about the theological meaning of the day before. And since the endowed lectureship was about pastoral theology, his talk can best be summed up in the following way. He said that the basic foundations of any authentic pastoral ministry are the apprehension of death and the experience of radical vulnerability. It is only when you have experienced those two things that your heart can be broken open in such a manner that you can feel the pain and suffering of others as if it were your own. And he said that is the moment in which we discover compassion. And that was a perfect explanation of what I had been through the day before, and how my heart had been cracked open by two things. By discovering that I was not afraid to die, which is being liberated from fear and anxiety and born into a whole new world. And secondarily, that moment in that circle of love when I discovered my intimate relationship with everyone else that is, and the true understanding of being as being with, being in relationship with, because love is the dynamic of the whole creation. That is what then led me to volunteer as a night superintendent at St. Paul's Chapel, which was where the relief ministry for the emergency workers emerged spontaneously. St. Paul's is a chapel owned by Trinity Church, which was my employer, it is directly across the street from Ground Zero. And it was spared in the terrorist attack. The whole cemetery behind the church was filled with debris, and actually it was the sycamore trees in that cemetery that saved the chapel. And so it became the center for the most important relief ministry at Ground Zero. And I became a night superintendent. Now, a little bit about my history. I'm a historian of science and a theologian. And for years I had had a passionate interest in the new sciences of chaos, complexity, emergence, and network theory. And I had worked out all of the basic principles of how a robust network works, but what I didn't have was experience in a parish ministry so that I could translate that theory into the practice of congregational development. And St. Paul's became my laboratory for connecting the theory of network theory with the actual practice of a Christian community. And what I watched over the course of the 9 months that I was a night superintendent at St. Paul's was the spontaneous organization of a Christian community around the principles of compassion and love. And it was an extraordinarily powerful experience. And I realized that some of the basic ingredients of a human organization organized according to the principles of network theory. It begins with a sort of a radical understanding of the connection with your immediate environment. And of course, at Ground Zero, everyone came there to address the threat that had been brought about to the life of that environment. And so we were all critically sensitive to what was going on in our environment. Secondarily, there was an absence of centralized control and command because the emergency office of the city of New York was in Building 7 that burned down that day. And so there was no authority to organize what was going on at Ground Zero. And what happened basically was spontaneous organization, people self-selecting into teams, not only in the pit, but also at St. Paul's Chapel. And so it was the absence of command and control that freed people up to become leaders and to initiate and respond to the chaos that was there in whatever way they saw fit. And so I watched a community of people bond in ways that blew away all the socioeconomic barriers that normally exist between us and allow us to work in unison with a common shared mission to address the needs of the immediate environment. And about that same time I began to read Brian McLaren's books, and I read a book by Bulger and Gibbs on the emergent church, and realized, surprisingly enough, that the emergent church was a self-organizing system, that it indeed exemplified everything that I had discovered at St. Paul's. And what I realized was that the emergent church gave theological legs to network theory, that the sensitivity to the environment in the emergent church was exemplified by the kingdom of God and the commitment of the emergent church to healing the world and bringing about the kingdom of God on earth as God willed. And secondly, I realized that the absence of centralized control was all about Jesus' teachings about servant leadership, which likewise the emergent community is totally committed to. So what I realized you guys had done was come to understand the real theological meaning of the way in which human and natural systems naturally organize themselves. And you have created a body of people who are living out the new way of being in this world. And so I became deeply involved in the emergent church movement. I asked Steve Knight and members of the Charlotte cohort to attend a conference that I had organized on, it was called American Christianity Reorganizing Itself. And that got me involved with the Charlotte cohort, which I now attend when I can, and began my entry into your exciting movement.